Well, as was just mentioned, just about 7 years ago, after just over 40 years of living in blissful ignorance, I discovered that through the oddest of circumstances, that I am likely descended on my mother's side from Spanish Portuguese Jews. The first record of, well, my mother's maiden name is Dorta, which is a very uncommon surname. The Dortas of Puerto Rico believe that we were, similar to the Jews of Belmonte who believed that they were the only Jews, the Dortas of Puerto Rico believed we were the only Dortas. I had to actually come to Israel and meet Moshe Ortas and discover that that is not true, that we do have a family that reaches farther out from Puerto Rico to the Canary Islands to Portugal, to Spain, and ultimately to Israel. The first record of a Dorta I could find was a Meyer Dorta, signatory to the Jewish ordinances of Tudela, Spain in 1363, which really surprised me. There was also a record of a Jewish Dorta living in Madeira, Portugal in 1497 as a sugarcane farmer. I also found a reference to a group of Dortas who historians note were the last Jewish printers in Portugal and who printed the astronomical tables of Abraham Sacuto. And actually, Moshe Ortas and I have that common lineage. There was a Garcia Dorta, whose parents were expelled from Spain in 1492 and who sailed for India in 1534 as a chief physician aboard the fleet of his childhood friend, the future governor of Portuguese India. The year after Garcia de Orta died, in 1568, his sister, Catarina de Orta, was burned at the stake by the Inquisition in Goa, and in 1580s, his remains were exhumed and also burned. And I recall reading about that. When I first read about that, it actually affected me a lot emotionally. It was very, very odd. I had never met Catarina de Orta before, but I came across that, and I guess I thought about how, well, I have a sister too, so I thought about how Garcia de Orta, since he could no longer protect his sister, how she was burned at the stake and how. Anyway, let's move on. I discovered through the Arquivo Nacional Torre do Tombo in Portugal records of at least 20 Dortas who were arrested by the Inquisition, most of whom were arrested for the crime of practicing Judaism. And actually I found a record with the same name as my mother, which is she has a very uncommon first name and a very uncommon last name, and it was actually just about the woman who had been arrested by the Inquisition was about the same age as my mother, so also that it was I felt a connection to these people. They seemed, they helped me to understand myself better, and in an odd way, the blood calls. Their suffering from so long ago called out to me, and I felt a need to do something for them. I just didn't know what to do. Then just a few months ago, I came across an article about a woman named Sonia Loya, and her idea about a lawsuit on behalf of the Bnei Anousim against the Inquisition, and I was intrigued. So I reached out to Sonia. However, a lawsuit against the Inquisition, as you can imagine, is a very difficult thing to do for several reasons, and this is very much in its initial stages. I've just started to look at it just a couple of months ago. Most of my fellow lawyers, when I first mentioned this case with them, are initially very pessimistic about its potential. But then, as I begin to explain to them my strategy, at some point in the conversation, I see their eyes light up suddenly, and they say, hey, this could work. This could work, but there are serious barriers that have to be overcome. First of all, of course, there's simply the time that has elapsed since the Inquisition and the statute of limitations issues. Now, there are certain precedents in the Holocaust litigation for overcoming statute of limitations issues by alleging unjust enrichment. Roughly, and this is very rough, you have to show that the offending party or its successor still has the wealth that was taken unjustly. So the statute of limitations hasn't really begun to run, and then you can sue for the recovery of the wealth that was taken due to the bad act. This same argument can be used, very useful in this case, because the Inquisition took very good records, and thus I believe that we will be able to trace the money. Nevertheless, the Holocaust litigation based its claim under the U.S. Alien Torts Claims Act, which was from 1790, and many of the crimes of the Inquisition were committed before then. So that presented me with a real issue. Fortunately, there are some very old precedents establishing certain rights of the Anousim, which I find quite promising. For example, in 1645, near Recife, Brazil, a Portuguese rebelling against the Dutch captured a Dutch militia that included a squadron of Jews with a Jewish captain. The Portuguese separated the Jews from the other prisoners. They hanged all the Jewish prisoners, and they burnt the captain alive. In their view, the Jewish prisoners, who had been new Christians under the Portuguese and then reverted to the practice of Judaism when the Dutch had captured Recife, were traitors and heretics and deserved this punishment. So the Anousim in Amsterdam petitioned the States General in Holland with tears of blood running from our hearts, ordered the government of Brazil to ensure that in all agreements with the enemy, members of the Hebrew nation should be treated like other Dutch subjects. So the States General in December 7th, 1645, issued the Patente Honrosa, the honorable charter, declaring Holland's Jews to be Dutch subjects entitled to nearly all the rights pertaining to the burgher class. It instructed the Supreme Council in New Holland that the Hebrew nation in Brazil is to be protected from any damage to person or property in the same manner as all citizens of the United Netherlands. Now, I also discovered there was a reference to a Jacob Dorta who directly benefited or should have benefited from the Patente Honrosa, as he was a Jewish prosecutor living in Recife at the time of the Civil War, and thus is identified by one historian as one of the first three openly Jewish lawyers in the Americas. I have also discovered there were actual papal bulls secured by the Anousim in September and October of 1539, which insisted on certain rights of due process in Inquisition proceedings, which normally only existed in a civil trial, including the inadmissibility of evidence extracted by torture and punishment for false accusations, which were simply, these bulls were simply never enforced in Portugal. Thus, the Anousim were very successful in their efforts to define their rights under the law. Nevertheless, it was impossible to enforce that law in the states in which the Inquisition held sway. For example, the Patente Honrosa was put to test in 1648 when Portuguese rebels seized 10 Jews from a Dutch ship and sentenced them to death. The States General submitted a formal demand to Portugal's King John IV. At that time, Holland and Portugal had an executed peace pact and alliance against Spain, and so they submitted this demand saying that the Jews be treated like other Dutch subjects. So King John replied in 1649 that the rebels had assured him that those Dutch Jews who had not been baptized would be set free, but that he could not interfere in heretical matters involving false conversos. The rebels turned certain of these Jews over to the Inquisition. So King John's reply to me is interesting. He's recognizing the validity of the law, but he is interpreting it in his own fashion. And there was no independent tribunal at the time with the power of enforcement to tell him that he was wrong. So these laws were on the books at the time, put there by the efforts of these Anousim. These laws were violated, and although it was impossible to stop the violation or sue for damages based upon their violation at the time, because the Inquisition and their allied countries could just take out their guns and say, "Make me," it is simply no longer the case that they can take out their guns and say, "Make me." Thus, these laws that were put in place so many years ago There were laws there. The unlawful acts occurred. The unjust enrichment from the unlawful acts continue to this date, so the statute of limitations hasn't begun to run. And today, there are courts with enforcement power over the entities that, to this date, unjustly hold property confiscated in violation of international law existing at that time, which courts can force these entities to return the property. So in many regards, our ancestors have done most of the work for us. There are numerous cases of Jews living under the protection of countries such as England and Holland who, during their travels to, say, Portugal, were captured by the Inquisition. For example, I found a reference to a Felipe Dorta Enriquez, also another Dorta, a merchant in Amsterdam. Felipe Dorta Enriquez had also previously served the Dutch as a firearms instructor during the conquest of Recife, and he was the father of Jacob Dorta. The reference states that he went to Lisbon on business in 1639, where he was imprisoned because of his religion by the Inquisition, and that his Jewish alias is Moses Dorta, like Moshe. And he was no special case. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands like him. And as an interesting coincidence, one of my grandfather's brothers was also named Felipe Dorta. There was another interesting precedent set by the Robles trial in 1536 England, and I'm sure many does anyone know about the Robles trial, or should I? No. Okay. Well, then I'll tell you about that. 5 minutes. Okay. Well, let me. Let me get some of this quickly. I'll skip a lot. Now, I'm going to have to skip over the Robles trial, but to make a long story short, in the Robles trial, there was another precedent set that established the rights of the Hebrew nation that I believe that I can use. And what's interesting to me is that a lot of the fellows involved in putting these laws together, putting these laws in the books, were people that were involved in things like privateering, which is legalized piracy. And that's why the title of this paper is Jewish Pirates and Lawyers of the Caribbean and Their Fight Against the Inquisition, because sometimes I wonder if these fellows would have ever thought that, you know, they fought against the Inquisition on the sea. Some of them mention how they fought on the sea and the land, and actually they're fighting them today, 360 years later, by giving me the tools to do so. That's it.